All right, guys. This is a sort of brief overview of the ideas of imagery and figures of speech and poetry. Um, Imagery, you might think, is something that is purely something that paints a picture sort of in your mind. And that is what imagery is, but imagery extends beyond that to really kind of touch the five senses. So imagery creates sensory interpretations on the part of the audience. So it brings the story to life, but it's more than just visual. It can be tactile, it can be sound, it can be smell, it can be taste as well. So it can impact any of the five senses, and it can have connotations that create an atmosphere or a mood beyond just painting the picture. So, for example, in Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, which you'll read, is a poem that really creates this sense of calm and peace and isolation away from the busy world. So the reader's experiences also can shape meaning when you're interpreting imagery. So we all have very strong sensory experiences to certain things in life that we can sometimes bring to a poem when we're reading it. So, for example, if you were reading a poem about Grandma's kitchen, you might have your own sensory images of apple pie or, tinkling glasses or radio on in the background or birds chirping out on the farm that you might associate with that poem. And that may not be the intended meaning by the author, but it can still kind of influence and create meaning for us as readers. So imagery is often used to kind of create this static, frozen moment in time. There's a poem called The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, where he's talking about the red wheelbarrow with white chickens in the yard. And that's really pretty much the whole poem. And it's taking this frozen moment of time and kind of analyzing, looking at it, bringing it to life. But nothing's really happening. Some, however, can be, some imagery can be kinetic. So it can create these ideas of movement or motion or change. So there's a poem, one of the lines says, "The wheels were rumbling through a dark city." That's suggesting motion, action, change. It's different than just taking a scene and looking at it with your senses. Synesthesia is a word you might have heard. It's really using one sense to describe another. So a lot of times people who have synesthesia say that they can see sounds or hear colors or something like that. You also have that in figurative language. So if you say that you are feeling blue, you're using a color to describe an abstract emotion or physical state. So that is synesthesia. Now, figures of speech are different. Figures of speech appear in poetry to create sort of a deeper or richer meaning for an audience. So a simile, a lot of these are very basic. Simile, is a comparison using like or as. There's a line in, I believe, a Robert Frost poem where he says, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." If he had just said, "I wandered lonely," that would still get the meaning across, but it doesn't quite have the same impact or connotation as a cloud, because the cloud suggests sort of floating. It suggests ice, sort of being above the working or worried world. It's kind of drifting aimlessly without direction and without the ability to control itself. So all of these sort of qualities or intonations come into the simile when we use like or as. A metaphor, of course, is a comparison without using like or as. There's a Emily Dickinson poem called "Hope is the Thing with Feathers." And that, of course, is just comparing hope, this sort of bright, happy, ever light idea. Personification is, of course, giving human or lifelike qualities to an inanimate object or an abstract idea. So, for example, we have a poem called "Harlem" by Langston Hughes, where he talks about what is a dream deferred. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And so he's personifying this idea of a dead dream, essentially. Same thing in Emily Dickinson's "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." She personifies death and says, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." So she creates this personhood out of the idea of death. And an extended metaphor simile is used throughout a poem to really compare the two ideas sort of in an extended fashion. Hyperbole is an intentional exaggeration for effect. So, for example, I love you so much I could die. That's obviously an exaggeration. An understatement is the opposite, of course. It's intentionally saying less than is meant. So, Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. He says, some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. For me, from what I've tasted of desire, I prefer fire. And it's very glib, it's very short. And he's talking about sort of the end of the world. So it's clearly an understatement. An apostrophe is when the speaker is speaking to an absent person or thing. So Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. The speaker is addressing this nightingale, but you never interact with it. You never hear it speak back. The speaker is the only one speaking. So you see that sort of throughout the poem. So that really is what you need to know about imagery and figures of speech.